In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And one garden on a world called Vhorrek Quintus, where flowers grow from the inside of human skulls, roots threading through eye sockets, splitting the palate, cracking the jaw apart like a seed through soil. He stood there 3 hours, watching a bud force its way out of a dead woman's face. When it opened, the air turned amber with spores. He breathed in every particle. And he thought, with the warmth you'd feel watching a child take its first steps, this is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is told by something that has been alive for nearly 9,000 years and dead for almost as long. And will tell you there's no meaningful difference between the two. But he'll start at the beginning. A boy on a world called Cenotaphs, back when the universe was simple and he still had all his fingers. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. There is a garden on the world of Vhorrek Quintus, where the flowers grow from the inside of human skulls, not planted there by some deranged artist. They just grow. The roots thread through the eye sockets, split the palate, crack the mandible apart like a seed pushing through soil. The petals are a shade of violet that does not exist in any imperial botanical index, and they smell like wet copper and overripe fruit. I stood in that garden for what must have been 3 hours, just watching a new bud force its way through the nasal cavity of a woman who had been dead for perhaps 2 weeks. When the bloom finally opened, it released a cloud of spores so thick the air turned amber. I breathed it in, every particle. And I thought to myself, genuinely, with the kind of warmth you might feel watching a child take its first steps, this is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. That was 600 years ago, give or take a century. I have been alive for nearly 9,000 years and dead for almost as long, and the trick is that there is no meaningful difference between the two. But you want the story. Fine. I have nothing but time and a body that refuses to stop working, no matter how many pieces fall off it. Let me take you back to when I was a boy on Cenotaphs, and the universe was simple, and I still had all my fingers. Cenotaphs was not the worst world in the Imperium. I know this because I have since visited the worst world in the Imperium, and it was significantly more unpleasant. But Cenotaphs was not trying to be pleasant either. It was a mining colony in the Tefron Reach, a cluster of systems so far from the light of the Astronomicon that the ore transports ran on a route the navigators openly hated, and made the trip as rarely as the tithe schedule permitted. The surface was ferrite and dense obsite, layered so tightly that the ground rang like a bell when you struck it. The air was thin, the radiation was constant, and the indigenous fauna consisted primarily of burrowing predators that could chew through 3 centimeters of plasteel in under a minute. We called them grinders. The administratum called them Cenotaphs subterranean apex predators, variant 9, which tells you everything you need to know about the administratum's priorities. We lost about 12% of the mining shifts to grinder attacks every cycle. The overseers considered this acceptable. They were not being callous. The administratum's tolerance threshold for a Class 4 extraction colony was 15%, which meant that Cenotaphs was, in the eyes of the Imperium, performing above expectations. There was a commendation plaque in the overseer's hab. I saw it once. It was very shiny. I was born in Shaft Collective 19, which was not a city and not a settlement, and not even really a place. It was a wound in the ground where people happened to live because the ore was close to the surface, and the grinders were slightly less dense in that sector. My mother worked the deep shafts. My father worked the deep shafts. My older brother worked the deep shafts until a grinder took him at the waist, and he worked nothing ever again. That was the shape of life on Cenotaphs. You were born. You went into the ground. You pulled out ore until something pulled you apart. If you were lucky, you lived long enough to produce children who would repeat the cycle. If you were very lucky, you died quickly. I was not lucky. I was something else. The Cenotaphs came to Cenotaphs every 40 years for their tithe of recruits. I did not know what the Cenotaphs were. None of us did, really. We knew that men in gray armor came from the sky, that they tested the young, and that the ones they chose never came back. The overseers told us it was an honor. The miners told us it was a death sentence. Nobody told us what it actually was, which was both of those things simultaneously, and also neither. I was 14 standard Terran years old when they tested my cohort. There were 600 of us, boys between 12 and 16, lined up in the central processing cavern of Shaft Collective 19. The Cenotaphs sent 3 Marines to conduct the evaluation. 3 for 600 children. That ratio tells you how many they expected to be worth their time. They did not introduce themselves. They did not explain the process. The first test was a blood draw, performed by a servitor that moved down the line with mechanical indifference, jamming a needle into each boy's neck and extracting a sample. 71 boys were pulled from the line after the blood work. Genetic incompatibility, they said later. What that meant in practical terms was that their blood would have rejected the implants and killed them within weeks. Those 71 went back to the mines. I sometimes wonder how many of them are still alive. I sometimes wonder, and then I remember that the answer is none of them, because Cenotaphs no longer exists. And then I stop wondering. The second test was pain, controlled, measured, escalating, and they watched to see who broke, not who screamed. Everyone screamed. They watched for the boys who stopped being present, who went away behind their own eyes and let the pain become the whole of them. Those were removed. What the Cenotaphs wanted was boys who could be in agony and still think, the capacity to suffer without being consumed by suffering. I did not understand then why that was the quality they prized above all others. I understand now. 81 of us passed the pain threshold. The third test was the simplest and the cruelest. They put us in a room with a single door, told us that only 20 would be taken, and left. No instructions, no rules, no weapons. Just 81 boys in a room with the knowledge that 61 of them would go back to the mines. What happened next was entirely predictable, and I think the Cenotaphs knew that, and I think that was the point. Within an hour, the room sorted itself into factions. Within 2 hours, the first bones were broken. Within 4 hours, 3 boys were dead. I did not kill anyone during that test. Not because I am ashamed of killing. I have killed more people than I could hope to quantify. But the truth matters in its specifics. What I did was simpler and, I think, more telling of the man I would become. I sat in the corner, watched the chaos unfold, identified the 6 largest and most aggressive boys, and then walked up to each of them individually and offered an alliance. Not a friendship, not loyalty, a transaction. Help me eliminate competitors, and I will not compete against you. 6 alliances, 6 boys who each thought I was their personal asset. By the time the Cenotaphs opened the door 12 hours later, 23 of us were still standing, and 12 of those were standing because of deals I had brokered. The Cenotaphs took 20 as promised. I was among them. 3 of my 6 allies were not. I did not feel guilt about this. I am not sure I have ever felt guilt about anything, which is either a tremendous character flaw or the single greatest gift the universe has ever given me. I suspect it is both. The journey from Cenotaphs to the fortress monastery on Thessivane took 11 weeks in the warp. I will spare you the implantation. You have heard it before. They cut you open and put things inside you that do not belong in a human body, and you come out able to hear a heartbeat across a crowded room and smell the adrenaline in a man's sweat, and something less than human in ways that nobody lists on the recruitment slate. 6 of the 20 taken from Cenotaphs did not survive the implantation. Their bodies rejected the organs, or the organs rejected them, or something went wrong in the deep chemistry that nobody bothered to explain to us. The apothecaries recorded a 70% success rate and considered it a triumph of the medical arts. The 6 were not mentioned again. Not their names, not their failure, not the fact that they had ever existed at all. In retrospect, this should have told me something about the chapter Y had joined. At the time, I simply assumed it was how these things were done. But you know all that. What you do not know is what it was like to be a cenotaph. The Cenotaphs were a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, founded in the 32nd millennium. I never learned our precise founding, the numbered one, the one the administratum records in its ledgers. The chapter masters kept that information close, along with certain other details about our origins that turned out, in the fullness of time, to be considerably more relevant than any of us suspected. What I can tell you is that by the time I arrived at Thessivane, the Cenotaphs had been killing the Emperor's enemies for over 1,000 years. Our gene seed was stable, our doctrine was orthodox, and our reputation was built on a single defining principle. We commemorated our dead by forgetting them. Most chapters honor their fallen with great ceremony. They inscribe names on walls, preserve armor in reliquaries, sing the deeds of the dead in hymns that echo through the halls for centuries. The Cenotaphs did the opposite. When a brother fell, his name was spoken one final time at a brief ceremony, and then it was erased from the rolls, from the records, from the memories of his brothers. His armor was repainted, re-blessed, and given to his replacement without comment. His weapons were redistributed. His personal effects, if he had any, were destroyed. In place of all these things, a single empty tomb was carved into the stone beneath the fortress monastery. No name, no inscription, no indication of who had occupied it in life, just an empty space in the rock, sealed and silent, identical to every other empty space beside it. Chaplain Vhorrek explained it to me when I was a neophyte. A name on a wall becomes a legend becomes an expectation becomes a chain. The dead should not shackle the living, and the dead should not be individuals at all. They should be a weight, water poured into an ocean. You do not mourn a single drop. You marvel that the ocean exists. I found this philosophy deeply appealing. I still do, actually. The grandfather works on similar principles, though his ocean is made of rather different substances. People assume it must have been hidden. It was not hidden. The doctrine of the empty grave was written down and submitted to the ecclesiarchy and the Ordo Hereticus during the audit that follows every chapter's 2nd century. Men whose entire function is to identify the moment faith curdles into something else read the words "nothing lasts" and "individual identity is a chain," compared them against the imperial creed, and found them sound. They found them admirable. Our austerity was commended in writing by men who would have burned us where we stood if they had understood a single word of what they were reading. The Imperium of Man read the road that led us to Nurgle, stamped it approved, and filed the stamp. There were 783 empty tombs beneath Thessivane when I completed my initiation. I walked those corridors on the night of my elevation, running my fingers over the sealed stone, and felt something I could not name. Not reverence, not grief. Recognition. The Cenotaphs called this the doctrine of the empty grave, and thought it was humility. It was surrender, and surrender is the first step on the road to the garden. But that was later. For now I was young, I was strong. I was a freshly minted battle brother of the Cenotaphs, and the galaxy was full of things that needed killing. My first decades of service were exactly what you would expect. I will not bore you with catalogs of campaigns and kill tallies and strategic summaries. I fought orcs on Helvrain Secundus, where the spore growth was so thick you could not see your own feet, and the ground squelched with every step. I fought Eldar on the crystalline plains of Vhorrek, where the air itself seemed to bend around their movements, and their weapons sang notes that I can still hear in my dreams 9,000 years later. I fought human rebels on Carnifax Station, which was a void habitat the size of a small continent, where the population had decided that the imperial tithe was optional. It was not optional. We explained this to them in terms they could not misunderstand. I was competent, not exceptional, not a champion, not the kind of warrior whose name would have survived the doctrine of the empty grave had things gone differently. I was a solid, reliable mid-range battle brother who followed orders, held positions, and killed what needed killing without unnecessary flair or unnecessary failure. In the Cenotaphs, this was the highest possible compliment. We did not celebrate heroes. We celebrated consistency. The brother who held his section of the line for 14 hours without deviation was valued above the brother who made a single glorious charge. Endurance over spectacle, persistence over brilliance. Two brothers, then. Vhorrek was a slab of muscle and silence from the agri-collective zones of Thessavane's southern continent, where they grow protein yeast in sealed vats, under a sky the color of an old bruise, and the workers wear rebreathers from the age of 6 because the fertilizer runoff has been in the atmosphere for 11 centuries. He was recruited 2 decades before me. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his observations arrived with the blunt efficiency of a bolt shell. On Carnifax Station, when the rebel leader broadcast a 12-minute speech about freedom and dignity and the inherent rights of man, Vhorrek listened to the whole thing, considered it for approximately 4 seconds, and then said, "He seems upset." That was all. The entire 4th Company heard it over the squad vox, and for 3 weeks afterward, every time a tactical situation deteriorated beyond recovery, someone would key the vox and say, "He seems upset." It became the closest thing the Cenotaphs had to a joke. It was not very funny. We found it adequate. Durat was the opposite. A tall, angular brother from a void station in the outer system who talked constantly, mostly about weapons maintenance and the comparative ballistic properties of different bolt ammunition types. He could recite the muzzle velocities of every standard pattern bolter variant in the Imperial Armory, and frequently did, to no one's request. Durat was also the finest marksman in the 4th Company, possibly in the entire chapter, though the doctrine of the empty grave ensured that no official record would ever reflect this. He did not mind, he did not shoot for recognition. He shot because the mathematics of trajectory and impact fascinated him in a way that nothing else did, and the act of putting a bolt round through a target at maximum effective range produced in him what I can only describe as a quiet, private satisfaction that asked nothing of anyone. I served for 312 years as a loyalist Astartes. I fought in 47 major engagements and an uncountable number of minor actions. I rose to the rank of tactical sergeant, leading a squad of 10 in the 4th Company under Captain Raythane, 9 brothers and myself. Vhorrek and Durat were in my squad. They had been in my squad for over a century by the time we deployed to Verada. I knew their patterns the way I knew my own heartbeat. I knew that Vhorrek would hold any position until ordered to withdraw, or until the position ceased to physically exist, whichever came first. I knew that Durat would find the angle, the elevation, the impossible sight line that turned an unwinnable firefight into a controlled elimination exercise. They were my brothers, my tools, my constants in a galaxy that offered very few constants to anyone. I spoke to Chapter Master Vhorrek exactly once in 312 years. It was during a resupply stop at an orbital dock above Thessavan, and it was routine, and it was forgettable. He was passing through the 4th Company's billets, which was rare, and he stopped near my squad's preparation bay and watched us for a while. Vhorrek was cleaning his blade in silence. Durat was field-stripping his bolter with the meditative precision of a man performing a rite. Then Vhorrek said to me or to nobody that the Cenotaphs were fortunate, that the empty grave had given us something most chapters lacked. Not strength, not discipline, the capacity to accept what comes. He said it flatly, without emphasis, and then he walked away, and I got back to my armor, and I did not think about it again for a very long time. And then we went to Verada, and the ocean dried up, and everything changed. Verada was a cemetery world. Yes, those exist. The Imperium of Man generates corpses at a rate that would bankrupt the death processing capacity of any rational civilization, and so there are entire worlds dedicated to the storage, cataloging, and ritual disposition of the dead. Verada was one of the oldest, a world of black stone and gray sky, where the mausoleums stretched from horizon to horizon, and the population consisted almost entirely of morticians, bone scribes, and the hereditary caretaker clans who had been maintaining the crypts since before the Great Crusade. It was a quiet world, a respectful world, a world where the loudest sound on any given day was the scratch of a stylus recording the name of some dead bureaucrat into an ossuary ledger. Verada received a tithe of the dead, not martyrs, not heroes, not the honored fallen of great battles, the administrative overflow of a subsector that had simply run out of room to bury its own. The transports came in on a schedule, and the bodies came off in numbered containers, and the caretaker clans processed them in the order they arrived. There was a backlog. Applications for interment were being reviewed at a rate of roughly 40 years behind submission. In the Imperium of Man, there is a waiting list to be buried, and it is longer than most people live. And then the Blighted Host came. The Blighted Host was a war band of Plague Marines. I need you to understand what that phrase meant to me at the time. I had fought traitors before. I had even fought chaos-corrupted Astartes on 2 occasions, renegades from no Chapter 1 recognized, feral and disorganized, and barely worthy of the gene seed they carried. But Plague Marines were different. Plague Marines were Death Guard, or the inheritors of the Death Guard's traditions, and the Death Guard had been rotting in the Eye of Terror for 2,000 years by the time we met them on Verada. They were not disorganized. They were not feral. They were ancient, patient, and possessed of a tactical doctrine that had been refined across millennia of unbroken warfare. They did not attack Verada because it was strategically valuable. They attacked it because it was full of corpses, and corpses are raw material. The Cenotaphs were one of 3 chapters dispatched to respond. The Verdigris Lions and the Ashen Sentinels arrived within a fortnight of us, and the 3 chapter masters met aboard the Silence Unending to divide the planet. I was not in that room. I was a sergeant. But I know what came out of it, because every man in the chapter knew within the hour, and because it was exactly what any of us would have predicted. Vhorrek asked for the north. The north was the worst of it. The fungal density was highest there, the mausoleum belt was thickest, and the blighted host's command elements were concentrated in it. The Verdigris Lions had a reputation for rapid assault, and the Ashen Sentinels for siege work, and either of them could have made a reasonable claim on the north on tactical grounds. Vhorrek's claim was not tactical. Vhorrek's claim was that the Cenotaphs were a chapter built to hold ground that could not be held and to endure conditions that could not be endured, and that if one of the 3 chapters had to be fed into the worst ground on Verada for 9 months, it should be the chapter whose entire doctrine was the acceptance of what comes. The other 2 chapter masters agreed. Of course they agreed. It was a generous offer, gracefully made, and it was consistent with everything the Imperium knew and admired about us. We arrived in the north expecting a siege. What we found was a garden, not a metaphor. An actual garden of flesh and fungus that had eaten 40% of the planet in the 6 weeks between the distress call and our arrival. The mausoleums were cracked open and the dead pulled out and rendered into a living ecosystem. Fungal towers the height of hab blocks, rivers of dissolved bone marrow, fields of what looked like grass until you got close enough to see that each blade was a filament of human nerve tissue still sparking. It was the most disgusting thing I had ever seen, and the most alive place I had ever stood, and both of those were true at once. I hated it with every fiber of my engineered, indoctrinated, emperor-fearing soul, but I noticed the patterns in it. I noticed the logic in how the rot fed itself. We fought the blighted host for 9 months. 9 months of grinding, attrition warfare through terrain that was actively trying to digest us. Our armor corroded, our weapons jammed. Our bolter rounds sank into fungal walls that healed faster than we could damage them. Something about their tactics bothered me even then, though I could not articulate it at the time. The blighted host did not fight to win. They fought to maintain contact. Every engagement followed the same pattern. They would hold a position just long enough to force us into the thickest concentrations of fungal growth, the places where the spore density was highest and the biological contamination most intense, and then they would withdraw, not retreat. Withdraw, deliberately, methodically, pulling back just far enough to draw us deeper. On 3 separate occasions, Durat identified clear avenues of retreat that the host had left undefended, corridors of clean ground where we could have disengaged and regrouped. Each time, Captain Rethane chose to press forward instead, because the tactical logic demanded it, because the mission was to destroy the enemy, and the enemy was right there in front of us, retreating into the rot. We followed. We always followed, and the rot followed us back. Brothers began to get sick, which should have been impossible. Astartes do not get sick. Our multi-lung filters toxins. Our oolytic kidney neutralizes poisons. Our Sus-An membrane can put us into hibernation if our bodies are overwhelmed. None of these defenses mattered on Verada. The sickness that crept through our ranks was not a toxin or a poison or a biological agent that could be filtered or neutralized. It was something older and more fundamental. It was a wrongness in the flesh itself, a whisper in the blood that told our cells to stop fighting, to stop repairing, to accept the inevitable truth that all organic matter is temporary, and that the only honest state of existence is gentle, painless dissolution. 14 brothers in the 4th Company showed symptoms within the first 3 months. Lesions that would not heal, joints that swelled and stiffened, a persistent cough that produced a gray-green mucus our apothecaries could not identify. They were isolated immediately, of course. Field quarantine, sealed transports, separate billets, full decontamination cycles between shifts. Our apothecaries were not fools, and our protocols were sound. By the 6th month, the number was 31, and the protocols had not slowed it by a single day, because whatever was moving through us was not moving through the air or the water or the wounds. It was already in us. It had been in us since we made planetfall. The quarantine was a man closing a door on a room the fire had already left. By the 9th month, when we finally broke the blighted host's command structure and drove their remnants off-world, the number was 147. 147 Cenotaphs out of a chapter strength of just over 800, carrying a sickness that our apothecaries could not cure, could not contain, and could not explain. We had also lost over 60 brothers to conventional combat during those 9 months, killed in the fighting before the sickness could claim them. 60-odd empty tombs that would never be carved. The Verdigris Lions lost 11 brothers on Varada. The Ashen Sentinels lost 19. Between them, across 9 months on the same planet, breathing the same air, fighting the same enemy in the same rot, they reported a total of 0 cases of the sickness. 0. I did not know that number at the time. I was a sergeant lying on a stone slab, watching my own hand fuse to my knee, and the joint after-action report was not circulated to sergeants. I read it 18 centuries later in our own archives. We had taken the chapter's records with us when we left Thessivane, all of them, crated and loaded and forgotten in a hold on the Silence Unending, because nobody had thought to burn them and nobody had thought to read them either. A warband does not have much use for the muster rolls of a chapter that no longer exists. But I had time, and I have always been the sort of man who reads things, and one long transit through the vortex, I went down into that hold and opened the crates. The figure was in the 3rd document I looked at. It was not buried. It was not coded. It was a table. Our apothecaries had it. Vortigem had it. The Ordo Malleus liaison attached to the campaign had it, and he was a man whose entire profession consists of noticing exactly this sort of thing. And every one of them looked at a plague that had infected 147 warriors of one chapter, and not a single warrior of the 2 chapters standing beside them, and concluded that the Cenotaphs had simply drawn the worst ground. We had drawn the worst ground. That much was true. We had drawn it because Vortigem asked for it. Nobody in the entire chain of command of the Imperium of Man asked the next question. And I want to be honest with you, neither did I. Not for another 500 years. Chapter Master Vortigem ordered a full withdrawal to Thessivane. Quarantine protocols were enacted. The afflicted brothers were isolated in the deep chambers beneath the fortress monastery, which meant they were sealed in the corridors between the empty tombs of our forgotten dead. I was among them. I remember lying on a stone slab between 2 unmarked graves, feeling my body betray me in ways I had never imagined possible, and thinking that the doctrine of the empty grave had never felt so literal. The sickness progressed. That is a clean word for it. What it actually did was take the idea of a human body and start asking questions. Why does skin need to stay attached to muscle? Why do bones hold their shape? Why do organs stay inside? Those have obvious answers when you are healthy. They are less obvious when you are lying in a pool of your own fluids, watching your left hand fuse to your right knee. I lost my sense of smell on the 43rd day of quarantine. This was actually a relief, because the deep chambers smelled the way I imagine the inside of a corpse would smell if the corpse were the size of a cathedral and had been dead for exactly the wrong amount of time. I lost my sense of taste on the 58th day. My hearing began to distort around the 70th day, which was the most unsettling change, because the distortion was not random. I began to hear patterns in the silence, rhythms, a low, subsonic pulse that seemed to come from beneath the floor, from the empty tombs themselves, as if the forgotten dead were breathing in unison. I reported this to the apothecary. He told me it was a hallucination. He also told me that my condition remained within acceptable parameters, which I have always suspected was less a diagnosis than a way of ending the conversation. He was wrong about the hallucination. It was a heartbeat, and it belonged to something much larger and much older than anything I had been trained to understand. On the 91st day of quarantine, Chapter Master Vhorrek descended into the deep chambers alone. I remember this clearly because it was the last time I saw him as he had been. He was a big man, even by Astarte's standards, broad across the shoulders and thick through the chest, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by a sculptor who disapproved of beauty. He wore his full plate, the gray and white of the Cenotaphs, with the chapter's icon on his left pauldron, an empty tomb beneath a single star. He carried no weapons. He walked through the quarantine zone slowly, methodically, stopping at each afflicted brother, looking into each ruined face. He did not speak. He did not offer comfort. He did not pray. He simply looked, and whatever he saw in our eyes, it led him to a decision that would define the next 9,000 years. Vhorrek left the deep chambers. He sealed the doors behind him, and then for 3 days, nothing happened. On the 4th day, the pain stopped. Not gradually, not in stages. It stopped the way a light goes out when you cut the power. One moment I was in agony, every nerve ending screaming, every cell in my body at war with itself. The next moment, silence. Peace. A warmth that started in my chest and radiated outward through my limbs, my torso, my skull. A warmth like being held, like being known, like being told after a lifetime of being a drop in an ocean that the ocean was aware of you, and the ocean was fond of you, and the ocean had a name. The name, of course, was Nurgle. I did not know that then. I did not know much of anything in those first hours of cessation. What I knew was that the pain had stopped and that my body was changing. Not decaying anymore. Not dissolving, changing, adapting. Becoming something that the sickness could not kill because the sickness was no longer fighting my biology. It was joining it. The lesions hardened into plates of calloused, discolored flesh, tougher than the ceramite of my armor. The swelling in my joints solidified into new structures, new articulations, new ranges of motion that a human skeleton was never designed to accommodate. The cough stopped, not because my lungs cleared, but because my lungs no longer needed to be clear. They filled with a warm, dense fluid that I could breathe as easily as air. A living culture of microorganisms that filtered toxins and generated nutrients and turned every exhale into a soft, spreading cloud of spores. I sat up on my slab between the empty tombs, flexed the fingers that still worked as fingers, and laughed. Not because anything was funny, because I had spent 3 centuries teaching myself that nothing lasts and nothing matters, and the only honest answer is surrender. And a god had just reached into my ruined body and said, "Correct. Well done. Now stop crying about it." The Cenotaphs died on the Sivain, not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment of betrayal. I have heard other war bands tell this story about themselves, and they always tell it as a battle. Half the chapter against the other half. Corridor by corridor, brother against brother, the whole tragic architecture of it. That is not what happened to us. The truth is worse. Only 43 of them fought. There were 589 brothers on Thessivain who had never shown a symptom. 589 loyal Astartes, unmarked, healthy, armed, and watching their chapter master walk out of the deep chambers, wearing the tri-lobe of the Lord of Decay on his pauldron. Every one of them had been raised from childhood on the certainty that this was the one thing worth dying to prevent. 43 of them raised a weapon. It took me 2,000 years to understand why, and when I did, it was not a comfortable thing to understand. They had all been on Vhorrek, every one of them. 9 months in the rot, breathing it, walking through it, bleeding into it. The apothecaries thought the sickness had touched 147 of us, because those were the ones showing lesions. The apothecaries were counting symptoms. They were not counting carriers. The grandfather had been inside every man who walked off Vhorrek, and had been since the day we made planetfall. The 147 were simply the ones who arrived first. The rest were still in transit, and when the deep chambers opened and the changed came up into the light, what those 589 men felt was not horror. It was recognition. 43 of them fought anyway, against a thing that was already in their blood. I still do not know whether that made them the bravest men I ever served with, or the slowest. Vhorrek was already among us when we emerged. I did not recognize him at first. His armor was no longer gray and white. It was a mottled green-brown, slick with moisture, and the chapter icon on his pauldron had been replaced by a symbol I had never seen before, but recognized instantly, the way you recognize a face in a crowd that you have only seen in dreams. The 3 circles, the tri-lobe, the mark of the Lord of Decay. Vhorrek had made his choice. He had made it for all of us. But I am no longer certain it was a choice, and I am no longer certain there was anything left for him to choose with. Captain Thane was one of the 43. My captain, the man who had led the 4th Company for 2 centuries, who had pressed us forward on Vhorrek into the thickest rot, because the tactical logic demanded it, stood in the corridor outside the deep chambers and raised his bolter and said, in a voice that cracked on every syllable, that this was wrong, that we were wrong, that whatever had happened to us was not a gift, but a violation, and that he would die before he accepted it. He was correct on one of those points. Durat, standing behind me, his bolter already beginning to sprout filaments of fungal growth along the barrel, looked at Thane for a long moment, and then looked away. Vhorrek did not look at all. They were killed in the corridors of the fortress monastery. All 43, their bodies absorbed into the new growth that was already spreading across the walls and floors and ceilings of what had been our home. I did not kill Thane, someone else did, but I did not stop it, and the distinction between killing a man and watching him die when you could have moved is narrower than people pretend. The chapter fleet, 6 vessels including the battle barge, Silence Unending, was secured within hours. By the time an astropathic distress signal might have been sent, there was no one left to send it. The Cenotaphs, all 693 surviving brothers, were remade. The empty tombs beneath the fortress monastery filled with fungal growth, each one becoming a small garden, a miniature ecosystem of rot and renewal. The fortress itself began to change, the stones softening, the angles blurring, the architecture dissolving into something more organic, more alive, more honest. We left Thessavane 3 weeks later. There was nothing to look back at. The Cenotaphs were gone. In their place was something new, something that did not yet have a name, a warband of Plague Marines who had not chosen their fate, but had been chosen by it. My name, the name that had been spoken once and then, erased according to the doctrine of the empty grave, was Vhorrek. I took it back. I took it back because the grandfather does not ask you to forget. The grandfather asks you to remember everything, every wound, every scar, every loss, every failure, and to love it all equally because it all leads to the same place. And the place is beautiful. The first years after the turning were chaotic in every sense of the word. We had no direction, no allies, no understanding of what we had become or what was expected of us. Vortigem led us into the void, away from Thessivane, away from the sectors where the Cenotaphs had been known. I think he understood, even then, that the Imperium would come for us. Not immediately. The wheels of imperial bureaucracy turned slowly, and a single chapter going dark was not unusual enough to warrant immediate investigation. But eventually the questions would be asked. The tithe ships would find an empty world, and then the kill teams would be dispatched. Vortigem wanted distance and time, and a place where the newly blessed could learn what they were, without the inconvenience of being hunted. We found that place in the Screaming Vortex. The Screaming Vortex is not the Eye of Terror. It is smaller and more intimate in its horrors. A wound in real space where the immaterium bleeds through like pus through a bandage, the laws of physics become suggestions, and time runs at whatever pace the local mood dictates. We entered near the Calixis sector, and a 3-week transit took either 4 days or 11 months, depending which chronometer you asked. Inside the vortex, we found others. War bands, cults, demon packs, petty kingdoms of the lost and the damned. The Screaming Vortex is a gathering place for those who have turned from the Emperor's light, and it is exactly as welcoming as that description suggests. We were attacked within hours of our arrival by a cornate warband called the Flayed Chorus, who saw our freshly corrupted state as an invitation rather than a warning. They killed 19 of us before we drove them off. 19 brothers, lost not to the Imperium, not to the enemies of chaos, but to other servants of the Dark Gods who simply wanted what we had. Welcome to the Long War. The orientation process is violent and mandatory. Vortigem established a base on a dead world called Grethen, a place where the atmosphere was 90% methane, and the surface was covered in the petrified remains of a civilization that had died so long ago that even the warp had forgotten them. We dug in, we fortified, we began the slow, painful process of understanding what Nurgle's gifts actually meant in practical terms. Nobody warns you that the physical part is the easy part. Your flesh rots and regrows on a loop. Boils hatch into clouds of carrion flies. Your gut turns so aggressive it will process anything organic, and a good deal that is not. I once ate part of a bulkhead door out of curiosity. It tasted like iron and sadness, and my body had it broken down into nutrients inside 6 hours. The mind takes longer. Decay stops looking like destruction. A corpse becomes a seedbed. Rust becomes metal returning to honesty. You do not decide to see it that way. You simply start seeing it the way you see color. I am getting ahead of myself. The newly turned Vhorrek on Grethane did not have these insights yet. The newly turned Vhorrek on Grethane was confused, angry, sick, in ways that had nothing to do with his body, and deeply uncertain about what came next. What came next was Hethric, Lord Hethric Vileborn, Plague, Lord of the Death God's 4th Vectorium, arrived on Grethane approximately 2 years after we had established our base. He came in a single-strike cruiser, the Postulant Grace, which was so heavily corrupted that it was difficult to tell where the ship ended and the biological growth began. The hull was encrusted with barnacle-like growths that pulsed with bioluminescence, and the engine exhausts trailed not plasma, but a thick greenish vapor that settled on everything it touched and immediately began to corrode it. The ship entered orbit over Grethane and simply waited. No hails, no demands, no threats. It just sat there, leaking disease into the void, patient as a stone. Vortigem went up to meet him alone. He was gone for 3 days. When he returned, he told us that the Cenotaphs, or what remained of the Cenotaphs, had been offered a place within the Death Guard structure. Not as equals, not as honored allies, as vassals, subordinates, the remnants of a failed chapter absorbed into the oldest and most established force of Nurgle-aligned Astartes in the galaxy. Vortigem had accepted. He had not asked us. He had not consulted his captains or his chaplains or his sergeants. He had simply said yes, the way he had said yes to Nurgle in the deep chambers of Thessavane. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw something in the eyes of my brothers that looked very much like the anger of men who were tired of having their fates decided for them. The moment passed. It passed because we did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not complicated. We were 674 warriors on a methane world with no allies, no supply lines, no astropathic contact, and no idea what we had become. We had been in the screaming vortex for 2 years, and it had already cost us 19 brothers to a Kornite warband that had attacked us for no reason beyond proximity. There were dozens of such warbands in the vortex. Eventually, one of them would be larger than the flayed chorus. Eventually, the Imperium would work out where we had gone, and in orbit above us sat a strike cruiser belonging to the oldest, largest, and most established Nurgle-aligned force in the galaxy, whose commander had just offered us a place in it. Vortigem did not consult us because there was nothing to consult about. You do not hold a council to decide whether to accept water in a desert. And whatever anger flickered in my brother's eyes when he told us, it was gone within the hour, because every one of them ran the same arithmetic I did and arrived at the same total. We were Plague Marines now. We had accepted the gifts of a god whose central teaching is that resistance is futile and acceptance is strength. Arguing with the logic of surrender would have been, at that point, somewhat late. Vhorrek Vileborn was not what I expected. I had imagined the Death Guard as grim, humorless, plodding war machines, and some of them were. But Vhorrek was something else. He was old, truly old, a veteran of the Horus heresy who had walked on Terra during the siege and survived the retreat into the Eye. 2,000 years had not made him weary. They had made him patient. He moved slowly, spoke softly, and laughed at things that were not funny by any standard I recognized. The first time I heard him laugh was when a Nurgling swarm accidentally consumed a supply of rare alchemical reagents that he had been cultivating for 6 centuries. 6 centuries of work, dissolved in Nurgling digestive fluid. He laughed until his rusted armor shook and flakes of corroded ceramite fell from his pauldrons like brown snow. When I asked him why he was laughing, he looked at me with eyes that were the color of pond scum and said in a voice like wet gravel that anything which could be destroyed by Nurglings was not worth preserving in the first place. I liked him immediately. Under Vhorrek's command, we were integrated into the 4th Vectorium's operations. This meant, in practical terms, that we stopped hiding and started fighting. The Death Guard do not fight for territory. They fight for spread, propagation, introducing the Grandfather's gifts to populations that have not yet had the opportunity to receive them. It is evangelism conducted with virus bombs and weaponized bacterial cultures that can empty a continent in 72 hours. The message of Nurgle is love. The delivery system is mass extinction. My first combat deployment as a Death Guard vassal was on a hive world called Cenotaphs, on the fringes of the Maelstrom. The objective was simple: infect the water supply of Hive Primus, the largest population center, with a tailored pathogen designated Strain Cenotaphs 7, and then prevent the Imperial garrison from implementing effective quarantine measures until the infection had spread beyond containment. The pathogen was beautiful in the way that all of Nurgle's creations are beautiful, which is to say that it was horrifying to anyone who had not been taught to see the beauty in biological innovation. Cenotaphs 7 targeted the human lymphatic system, converting white blood cells into vectors for a secondary fungal infection that colonized the lungs and sinuses. The infected did not die quickly. They lived for weeks, sometimes months, coughing spores into the air with every breath, each exhalation seeding the fungus into everyone around them. By the time the symptoms became visible, the entire hive was a garden waiting to bloom. We breached the hive's lower levels through a drainage system so corroded by our mere presence that the metal dissolved around us as we walked. 12 of us, former Cenotaphs serving under a Death Guard plague champion named Kail Thraxis, pushing through tunnels that were never designed for Astartes in full plate, let alone Astartes whose armor had developed external growths that added another 10 centimeters of bulk in every direction. The fighting was close, brutal, and deeply personal. The hive militia that met us in the tunnels were brave. They were ordinary humans, poorly armed, poorly trained, and they stood in our path and fired their last guns and knew, absolutely knew, that they were going to do. And they did it anyway. I respected them. I still respect them. I killed them with the same careful attention I would give to pulling weeds from a garden. Not out of malice, out of necessity. They were obstacles between us and the water purification nexus, and removing obstacles is what soldiers do. We held the nexus for 9 hours while the pathogen dispersed through the distribution network. By the time the Imperial Guard mounted a serious counter-assault, 11 million people had drunk contaminated water. The garrison's quarantine protocol, when they finally enacted it on the 9th day, was excellent. I mean that sincerely. Sector containment, movement restriction, water rationing, a public information program distributed by loudspeaker and Picti screen in 4 dialects. Textbook work. It would have been extraordinarily effective if it had been enacted on the first day, or if the water had not already gone out to 11 million people, or if quarantine meant anything at all against a pathogen with a 6-week incubation period and no visible early symptoms. But the paperwork was immaculate. I saw a copy of it later, recovered from a command bunker. Someone had signed every page. The math was simple after that. Cenotaphs 7 had an infection rate of approximately 94% in unprotected human populations. Hive Primus had a population of 63 million. Within 6 weeks, 59 million were symptomatic. Within 3 months, the hive was a tomb. Not a Cenotaph's tomb, empty and swept and deliberately forgotten. A Nurgle tomb, overflowing. Fungal forests climbed the hab blocks toward the hive's interior ceiling, photosynthesizing under bioluminescent bacteria that had colonized the light fittings. Insects that had not previously existed came up out of the corpse mulch to fill niches the extinction had opened. The hive breathed. It lived in a way it never had when it was a box full of people. I stood in the central plaza and felt that warmth again. The same warmth from the deep chambers under Thessivane. Not words, never words, only the certainty that this had not been destruction. It had been gardening. The Imperium found us in the 3rd century. People who tell stories about turning to chaos always skip the part where the Imperium responds, as though a chapter can walk away from 2,000 years of oaths and nobody files a report. Somebody files a report. It took the Administratum 80 years to notice that Thesivane had stopped paying its tithe, another 40 to dispatch an investigator, and roughly a century after that for the relevant files to climb high enough that a Lord Inquisitor read them and understood what they meant. They chose their moment with an accuracy I have to respect. Hethrick's Vectorium was 4 months of warp transit away, prosecuting a campaign in a subsector whose name I have forgotten, and the garrison left on Grethane was what garrisons always are. The wounded, the newly mutated, the ones whose gifts had not yet settled, and enough functioning brothers to hold a fortification against the sort of thing that attacks a fortification, which the Imperium was not sending. They did not escalate that far for us. The Imperium does not spend Grey Knights on traitors. Traitors are what you send a loyal chapter to handle, and there are 1,000 loyal chapters, and there have never been more than 1,000 Grey Knights in the entire galaxy at any point in their history. You do not spend that on 600 rotting Astartes squatting on a methane world. You spend it on what the methane world is turning into. By the 3rd century, Grethane was no longer dead. The Nurglings had come first, the way they always do, hatching out of the fortification walls and the ration stores and the corpses of our own dead. Then the growth, then the pools, then a thing in the western crater that had begun as a swamp and was, by then, thinking. Nurgle's attention had settled on that world the way weight settles on a mattress, and a chapter's worth of his blessed children were living inside the dent. An Ordo Malleus Inquisitor looked at the augur readings and did not see 600 traitors. He saw a demon world in its 3rd trimester. That is what the Grey Knights came for. We were incidental. I find that genuinely funny, and I have found it funny for 8,500 years. Then they came. They came with Grey Knights, which is what you send when the situation involves the ruinous powers, and you would prefer it to stop involving anything at all. 21 of them. Terminator plate, Nemesis force weapons, and the specific silence of warriors who have never in their lives needed to shout. They translated into the screaming vortex on a vector that should not have been navigable, made planetfall on Grethane without hail or warning, and began killing us in a manner so efficient that we did not understand a battle was occurring until the 3rd fortification had already fallen. We lost 211 brothers in 11 hours. 21 Grey Knights killed 211 Plague Marines. I was in the 4th fortification. I did not fight one of them directly, for which I remain sincerely grateful. I watched one of them fight Brother Kellund, who had been the finest swordsman in the old 4th Company, and the engagement lasted 4 seconds. Kellund was competent. The Grey Knight was something that competence does not have an answer to. They did not stay for us. They went through us. The Grey Knights crossed 4 fortifications and 211 brothers on their way to the western crater, and when they reached it, they killed the thing that was gestating there. And I am told, by brothers who were closer than I was and lived, that it took 9 of them holding a circle and singing to do it, and that the singing was worse than the killing. Whatever Grethane had been about to become, it did not become it. That was the mission. The 211 of us were terrain. Then the warp tides shifted on the 9th hour, and their strike cruiser began to lose station-keeping in a rift that eats ships the way rust eats iron, and their fleet gave them a 2-hour extraction window. They took it. They walked back to their landing zone through the corpses of everything they had killed. They collected their 4 dead. They left nothing behind, and they were gone before the 10th hour ended. I do not know what they wrote in their report. Grey Knights do not leave records that men like me will ever read. That is imperial vengeance. 200 years late, aimed at something else, and withdrawn on a schedule dictated by weather. We spent the next century regrowing. Nurgle's gifts make that possible in ways the Imperium has never fully appreciated. The crater healed too, eventually, though it took 1,000 years, and what grew back was slower and stupider than what the Grey Knights killed. But we never got back to what we had been, and we never stopped losing brothers. And that is simply the arithmetic of the long war. You do not replenish. You endure until you do not. That was my life for the first 5 centuries. Campaign, world, plague, repeat. The grandfather's will was simple. Go forth and multiply, not yourselves. The gifts. We took them to forge worlds and agri-worlds and shrine worlds, to soldiers and children and the very old, without preference and without malice. Nurgle does not hate. Nurgle does not discriminate. We were his gardeners, and the galaxy was our plot. I changed during those centuries. My left arm grew a second set of fingers out of the elbow, vestigial and mostly useless, but occasionally convenient for holding things. My rib cage fused into a single plate of bone and calcite that turns bolter rounds. My face settled into a configuration I am told is upsetting to look at, though I have not seen my own reflection in 4,000 years, and have no plans to. The internal changes mattered more. I stopped questioning and started observing, and I stopped fighting the current and started swimming with it. Enough of that. You wanted a story, not a sermon. In real space, time runs one way and carries you with it. In the warp, time is a swamp. It pools, stagnates, floods, drains. That is how I have lived for 9 millennia. Not through any technique or technology, simply by existing where the rules governing lifespan do not apply. We spent long stretches inside the screaming vortex between campaigns. Grathane remained our base, and it never stopped growing. What the Grey Knights had cut out of the western crater grew back. And then it spread, and by the end of the first millennium, the petrified landscape was gone entirely, replaced by a living biome that covered the whole planet. Pools of stagnant, bubbling liquid where new strains of bacteria were cultivated. Fungal forests where Nurglings cavorted in the canopy, their laughter a constant background noise like distant bells. Fields of decomposing organic matter that served as both food source and meditation ground, because there is nothing more meditative than watching a body return to its component elements over the course of several weeks. I spent my downtime learning. Vhorrek taught me plaguecraft, which is not the business of making something toxic and throwing it at people. Any fool with a toxin can kill. Plaguecraft is precision. You study the target's biology, their water, their food, the specific holes in their immunity, and you build a pathogen that walks through those holes while leaving enough of them breathing to carry it onward. Extinction is wasteful. The goal is transformation. Vhorrek taught me the names and properties of the 7 classical plagues, which are the foundational strains from which all Death Guard biological weapons are derived. He tried to teach me the rituals of the Tallyman, the practice of cataloging every blessing and every new mutation as it manifests, maintaining a precise ledger of the grandfather's generosity. I was, by Vhorrek's own assessment, the worst record-keeper in the Vectorium. My ledgers were incomplete, my entries were out of sequence, and on one occasion I recorded the same mutation 4 times across 3 separate months without noticing. He eventually stopped asking and gave the work to a brother who genuinely enjoyed it. There is always a brother who genuinely enjoys it. I have never understood them, and I have never wanted to. He taught me the dirge of 7 sorrows, a hymn so old that its origins predate the heresy, a song that resonates with the frequencies of decay and can accelerate the decomposition of organic matter within a radius of several dozen meters when sung correctly. I am not a good singer. I am possibly the worst singer in the entirety of the Death Guard, which is saying something because we are not a musically gifted legion. But I learned the dirge, and I sang it on battlefields across 100 worlds, and if the enemy found my voice more terrifying than my blade, well, that was a bonus. A word about Nurglings, because they are the single greatest creation in the catalog of demonic entities, and I will not apologize for that opinion. Small, round, perpetually cheerful, all bellies and grins and stubby limbs. They infest armor, weapons, food stores, ammunition hoppers. They have an uncanny gift for emerging at the exact worst moment. They are also genuinely dangerous, because one of them carries enough pathogens to empty a village, and a swarm of them can drown an armed warrior in sheer persistence. I adore them. One particular Nurgling attached itself to me during my 2nd century as a Plague Marine, and has not left since. It lives in a cavity in my chest plate that was originally a battle damage crater from a power fist impact. I call it decay, which is not its name, because Nurglings do not have names, but it responds to the sound, or at least it turns its head when I say it, which might just be coincidence, but which I choose to interpret as recognition. Decay has been with me through more millennia than I care to count. It has survived bolt impacts, plasma burns, orbital bombardments, and one occasion where my entire upper torso was temporarily separated from my lower torso by a cornate champion's axe. Decay was in the upper half. It seemed unbothered. Around the end of my 1st millennium as a Plague Marine, Vhorrek's Vectorium was recalled to the Plague Planet. This was significant. The Plague Planet is Nurgle's foothold in real space, a demon world in the Eye of Terror that exists simultaneously in the Materium and in the Grandfather's Garden. To be summoned there was an honor and a test and a judgment, all wrapped in one, and Vhorrek received the summons with the first expression of genuine anxiety I had ever seen on his decomposing face. We transited to the Eye of Terror via a warp route that I am reasonably certain does not exist on any navigational chart in the Imperium. The journey was smooth because the warp was welcoming. The warp is always welcoming when you are traveling toward a destination that the Chaos Gods want you to reach. We emerged in orbit above the Plague Planet, and I looked down at it through the viewport of the Postulant Grace, and for the 2nd time in my life, I experienced a moment of genuine, overwhelming awe. The Plague Planet is not really a world. Forests of bone-white trees whose leaves are sheets of human skin. Rivers of ichor running uphill toward fungal towers so tall they breach the atmosphere and trail spore clouds into orbit. Plains of flesh grass rippling in wind that carries the scent of 1,000 separate diseases. And underneath all of it, bleeding up through the crust into real space, the garden itself. You cannot walk in the garden with a body. But on the Plague Planet, the barrier is thin enough to stand in both places at once, and I stood there and felt the same slow pulse I had first heard under Thessivane, and I understood that I was home. We stayed for a period I cannot quantify, decades perhaps, centuries. The Grandfather stretches the pleasant hours and compresses the unpleasant ones, the way a good host keeps his guests comfortable. During our stay, Vhorrek met with the commanders of the Death Guard. He was given new orders, new objectives, new strains of plague to deploy. He was also given something else, something he did not share with anyone for 1,300 years, a piece of intelligence that would change everything I thought I knew about the fall of the Cenotaphs. But that is a story for its proper place in the telling. Before the truth, more war. Always more war. The campaigns blur after the first 2,000 years. You drop from orbit, you spread the grandfather's blessings. You kill whoever tries to stop you. You leave, you do it again. Every world is different, and every population rots in its own way, so it is never boring, but it compresses. Thousands of engagements become one long impression of effort and outcome. So here is one specific memory instead, because it matters more than the rest of them put together. The engagement on Kelvrath's cradle, approximately 16 centuries after the fall. Kelvrath's cradle was a shrine world, one of those places the Imperium builds when it has more faith than sense. A planet-sized monument to some saint whose actual deeds had been so thoroughly embroidered by the ecclesiarchy that the original person was unrecognizable beneath the mythology. The population was primarily clergy and pilgrims, supported by a modest garrison of PDF troops who had never fired a weapon in anger, and an astropathic relay station that served as a communications node for the surrounding subsector. Vhorrek wanted the relay station. Specifically, he wanted to introduce a slow-acting mimetic pathogen into the astropathic network, a corruption that would ride the psychic signals from world to world, gradually degrading the clarity of communications across an entire subsector. The infection would take decades to become noticeable and centuries to become critical, by which time the entire network would be transmitting Nurgle's influence along with its routine message traffic. It was the kind of operation that Vhorrek lived for, long-term, subtle, patient. The shrine world was defended by a chapter Juan had never encountered before. 30 Astartes, a demi-company, wearing livery of dark amber and bearing the sigil of a burning gate. They called themselves the Pyra Shield, and they fought the way Astartes fight when they are defending something they believe is sacred, which is to say they fought beyond reason, beyond tactics, beyond any calculus of survival. We outnumbered them 10-1. It did not matter. They held the relay station for 11 days, falling back through concentric defensive perimeters that they had clearly prepared in advance, making us pay for every corridor and every chamber. Vhorrek was the one who finally breached their inner sanctum. He walked through a doorway that had been rigged with 3 separate demolition charges, detonated all 3 with his body, and kept walking. The blast tore away most of the ceramite on his left side and exposed the gray-green flesh beneath. But Vhorrek did not notice or did not care, which amounted to the same thing. He walked through the fire and the shrapnel and killed the 2 Pyroshield brothers on the other side with his bare hands, because his bolter had been destroyed in the blast, and it had not occurred to him to stop. Durat, meanwhile, had found a position in the bell tower of the shrine's central cathedral, 700 meters from the relay station, and was methodically eliminating the Pyroshield's outer sentries with single shots that crossed the open ground between the 2 structures with a precision that made Vhorrek pause his command briefing to watch. Each shot was a masterwork. Each impact was placed at the exact junction of helm and gorget, where the armor was thinnest, the bolt round penetrating at an angle calculated to traverse the maximum amount of internal volume. 7 kills in 11 minutes. Durat did not celebrate. He reloaded. He found the next angle. He fired. The mathematics of trajectory and impact, unchanged since Thesavane, still producing that quiet, private satisfaction. It was on Kelvrath's cradle that I found something I dismissed at the time and would remember much, much later. After the relay station fell, Vhorrek ordered the astropathic archives seized intact. He wanted the message traffic. Not the content, particularly, but the routing data, the signal patterns, the frequencies that the Imperium used to bind its worlds together, so that his mimetic pathogen could be tuned to ride them without triggering the psychic wards. I was assigned to the extraction. 9 days sitting in a chamber full of dead astropaths and cogitator banks, sorting through 4 centuries of accumulated message logs, most of it administratum, tithe accounting, and ecclesiarchy, sermon distribution, and the endless, grinding bureaucratic sludge that constitutes the majority of interstellar communication in the Imperium of Man. Tedious work. I was the only one patient enough to do it properly, which Vhorrek knew, which is why he gave it to me. I am not complaining. 9 days sealed in a quiet room with a stack of parchment and a dozen corpses who had stopped making demands of me is, by the standards of my existence, close to a holiday. Somewhere in the middle of that ocean of paperwork, I found a founding notice. A routine administratum announcement distributed subsector-wide, listing the chapters authorized for refounding in that particular cycle. Gene seed allocations, recruitment world assignments, heraldic authorizations, and among the 17 designations on the list, one name that I had not spoken aloud in 1600 years. The Cenotaphs. I read it 3 times. Then I put the parchment down and went back to sorting routing data, because the routing data was the mission. But I remembered it the way you remember a stone in your boot on a march you cannot stop. Somewhere out there, the Imperium had built new Cenotaphs, wearing our colors, carrying our name. I filed it away, and it sat there, and I did not have cause to take it out again for the better part of 7,000 years. Through all of this, through the wars and the plagues and the slow transformation of my body and mind, I maintained the one quality that had defined me since childhood. I found it amusing. Not the killing, specifically, though the killing had its moments. Not the suffering, though suffering was the medium in which I worked. The absurdity, the sheer, magnificent, cosmic absurdity of existence. Here I was, a boy from a mining colony, recruited into a monastic order dedicated to the principle of forgetting, transformed by a plague god into an immortal engine of biological warfare, serving under a commander who had walked on terror during the siege, fighting a war that had been going on since before I was born, and would continue long after everyone I had ever known was dust. The scale of it was funny. The futility of it was funny. The fact that the Imperium of Man kept fighting, kept building, kept hoping in the face of a universe that was actively, demonstrably, provably indifferent to their survival, that was the funniest thing of all. Vhorrek noticed this quality in me. He called me mirthful, which was not a word I had heard applied to a Plague Marine before. He said that the grandfather valued joy, that Nurgle's domain included not only decay and disease, but also the desperate, defiant laughter of beings who understood that everything was falling apart and chose to find it wonderful anyway. He said that my particular brand of amusement, dry, observational, delivered without emphasis or emotion, was itself a form of worship. The grandfather does not want weeping. The grandfather does not want despair. The grandfather wants you to look at the rotting carcass of the universe and smile. Not because you are mad, but because you have finally understood the joke. I understood the joke. I had understood it since Califex, since the empty tombs, since the moment I looked at an ocean of nameless graves and felt not grief, but recognition. The joke is that nothing lasts, and the punchline is that this is fine, and the laughter is the sound of a being who has finally stopped pretending otherwise. And then, 2,300 years after the fall of the Cenotaphs, I asked Vhorrek a question, and the laughter stopped. Briefly. It happened on a world called Draven's Holt, a feral world in the Coronus expanse where we had been deployed to seed a long-term plague vector in the indigenous mammalian population. The operation was routine. The world was undefended. The inhabitants had no technology more advanced than Iron Age metallurgy, and no defenses against airborne pathogens beyond holding their breath, which, as a strategy, has significant limitations. We finished the seeding in 3 days and spent another week observing the initial infection spread, recording data for Vhorrek's catalog of pathogen performance metrics. 2,300 years is a long time to carry a stone in your boot, but it is not a long time to a Plague Marine, and I had been chewing on the same 3 facts since Vhorrek without ever setting them down. The blighted host had not fought to win. Durat had found 3 clean corridors of retreat that they had left open, and I had assumed at the time that it was an oversight because armies make oversights. And the plague that took us had passed through the oolitic kidney, the multi-lung, and the sus and membrane, as though the Emperor's gene science were a suggestion, which is not a thing that pathogens do by accident. I had been designing plagues for 2,000 years by then. I knew what it takes to build a pathogen that defeats Astarte's physiology. It takes a target, it takes time. And before anything else, it takes material because you cannot engineer a key without first holding the lock. And I knew where the material had come from the moment I let myself ask the question. Twice in my 300 years as a loyalist, the Cenotaphs fought chaos-corrupted Astartes. Twice. Renegades from no chapter any of us could identify, feral, badly organized, hitting worlds in the Tefron reach that had no strategic value whatsoever, and breaking contact after engagements that they could not possibly have expected to win. We recorded both as minor actions. I do not think we lost 20 brothers between them, but we lost some, and a body on a battlefield is not a body. It is a sample, and gene seed does not stop being useful just because the apothecary, who was supposed to recover it, did not get there first. Nurgle had been holding the lock for over a century before he ever started cutting the key. And there was the table, the one I had found in a crate in the hold of the Silence Unending, 500 years earlier, and had been carrying in my head ever since like a splinter I could not reach. 11 dead verdigras lions, 19 dead ashen sentinels, 0 sick. A plague that rots the flesh of Astartes does not check the heraldry on the pauldron before it decides whom to rot, unless somebody has taught it to. So I sat on that hillside watching a village cough itself toward transformation, and I said to Vhorrek, the plague on Vhorrek was built for us. Not for Astartes, for Cenotaphs, and it was built out of us. He did not answer immediately. Vhorrek never answered immediately. He watched the village for a while longer, and then he looked at me with those pawn scum eyes, and he said that he had been carrying that answer for 1,300 years, waiting for one of us to ask the question, and that he had begun to think none of us ever would. Then he told me, he did not ease into it. Vhorrek was not a man who eased into anything. The plague that struck us on Vhorrek was a targeted weapon, designed and deployed to infect the Cenotaphs and no one else. The blighted host did not bring the plague to Vhorrek. The plague brought the blighted host to Vhorrek. The entire campaign, the garden world of corpses, the 9 months of grinding warfare, the seemingly coincidental exposure of Cenotaph's battle brothers to corrupted biological material, all of it was orchestrated, arranged, cultivated, if you will forgive the gardening metaphor, which you should because it is the only metaphor that applies. The architect was the grandfather himself. And there was a smaller thing inside the larger thing, which is often how the grandfather works, and it took me a moment to see it. We did not win on Vhorrek. I had believed that for 2,300 years. It was, if I am honest, one of the few professional achievements from my loyalist life that I still held on to. 9 months of the worst attrition warfare I ever fought, and at the end of it we broke the blighted host's command structure and drove their remnants off-world. That was the report. That is what the Cenotaphs recorded, in the brief window before there were no Cenotaphs left to record anything. But the blighted host had never been fighting for Verada. They had been fighting to keep us in the rot. And at the 9-month mark, 147 of us were symptomatic, and the infection curve had gone somewhere that could not be walked back. So they left. That was all. We did not break them. They finished and they packed and they went home, and they let us have the planet and the victory and the commendation, and I spent the next 23 centuries carrying that engagement around as a thing I had done rather than a thing that had been done to me. Nurgle had chosen the Cenotaphs. Not at random, not because we were conveniently located or militarily valuable or genetically predisposed to corruption, although we were arguably all three. He chose us because of the doctrine of the empty grave. Vhorrek laid the rest of it out with the patient thoroughness of a man who has been rehearsing an explanation for over a millennium and is finally permitted to give it. The doctrine of the empty grave, the Cenotaphs' defining philosophy, was a road, a path, a one-way corridor leading from the Emperor's light to the Grandfather's arms, and every brother who had ever walked those silent corridors beneath Thesivane, running his fingers across the sealed tombs of the deliberately forgotten, had been walking that corridor without knowing it. Nothing matters. Individual identity is a chain. The only honest response to existence is to accept your own irrelevance. Surrender. Accept. Let go. These were Nurgle's teachings, not the Emperor's, not the Codex Astartes, not any loyal imperial philosophy. They were the core tenets of the Plague God's faith, dressed in monastic language and presented as humility when they were actually despair. The Cenotaphs had been worshipping Nurgle for their entire existence. They had simply been too ignorant to recognize the object of their devotion. 783 empty tombs beneath Thesivane. I walked those corridors as a boy of 40-odd, running my fingers over the sealed stone, and I thought I was touching a philosophy. The empty tombs were not a philosophy, they were a prophecy. And Nurgle, being Nurgle, had noticed. Gods notice when mortals pray to them, even when the mortals do not know they are praying. The doctrine of the empty grave was a hymn sung in a frequency that only the Lord of Decay could hear, and he had been listening for centuries, watching the Cenotaphs build their philosophy of surrender, refining it, perfecting it, making themselves into the ideal vessels for his gifts without any intervention required. All Nurgle had to do was wait until the vessel was ready, and then fill it. The plague on Verada was the filling. A pathogen tailored to Astartes' physiology and engineered to walk through every defense the Emperor's gene science had built into us. It was never meant to kill. It was meant to change, and it was built with such precision that change was the only outcome available. Death was never on the table. The only variable was how long we would suffer first, and the suffering was part of the design, because suffering makes surrender not merely acceptable but desirable. By the time Vhorrek came down into the deep chambers, we were not ready to accept the Grandfather's gifts. We were begging for them. We simply did not know who we were begging. And Vhorrek, the chapter master, the leader of the Cenotaphs, the man who had sworn oaths to the Emperor and the Imperium and the Codex Astartes and every other sacred text and institution that the loyalist Astartes hold dear. Vhorrek had known, not everything, not the full scope of the Grandfather's plan. But he had known that the plague was not natural, that it carried an intelligence behind it, that it was offering something rather than merely inflicting something. He had felt the grandfather's presence in the sickness, the way I had felt the heartbeat in the silence, and instead of fighting it, instead of calling for help, instead of alerting the Inquisition or another chapter or anyone at all, he had walked into the deep chambers and surrendered. Vhorrek told me that part as though it were the heart of the thing. Vortigem, the betrayer. Vortigem, who saw and chose. It is not the heart of the thing. I did not say so at the time. Vortigem was on Verada. Vortigem ordered the withdrawal. Vortigem walked through 9 months of that rot in the same armor as the rest of us, breathing the same air, and when he came back to Thesivin, he was a carrier exactly like every other man who came back to Thesivin. Whatever clarity descended on him in those 91 days, whatever certainty led him down into the deep chambers with no weapons and no prayers and no plan he ever shared with anyone, it did not descend from above. It came up from inside him. It had been living in his blood since planetfall, and it spoke to him in his own voice, using his own philosophy, in words he had spent 3 centuries teaching to other men. He was not a traitor. He was a symptom with the authority to open doors. I sat on that hillside and I listened to Vhorrek and I watched the village below, and I felt something that I had not felt in 2,300 years. I felt angry, not at Nurgle. You cannot be angry at a god for being a god. The anger went inward. At the boy in the corner of that room on Califex, brokering deals and thinking himself clever. At the brother who walked the empty tombs and felt recognition instead of grief. At the warrior who breathed the rot of Verada and thought quietly, in the part of his head he did not examine, that it was not entirely wrong. I was not a convert. I was a crop. The anger lasted 9 hours. Then I thought about it properly and arrived somewhere obvious. Decay is still true. Everything still ends. Those things do not become less true because a god arranged for me to notice them. A rose grown in a greenhouse is still a rose. Nurgle cheated. Of course he cheated. He is a god, and gods do not play fair. He wanted the Cenotaphs, and he took them, and the method was not cruelty. It was gardening. So I laughed. I had been angry at a gardener for growing crops. The garden grows whether or not the crop consents. Vhorrek watched me laugh. He did not join in. He simply nodded, slowly, with the infinite patience of a being who had known this truth for 2,000 years and had been waiting 2,300 more for me to catch up. Vortigem, I should note, was dead by this point. He had died during the 3rd millennium after the fall, killed by a rival plague lord in a dispute over a contested demon world. No drama, no meaning, no cosmic punishment for his betrayal. He was killed in a fight. His body went into the soil of the demon world where he fell, and within a week there was new growth on the spot. A small garden tended by Nurglings fed on a chapter master. The doctrine of the empty grave would have demanded he be forgotten. The grandfather made him part of the garden instead. I have never worked out which of those is worse, and I have stopped trying. After the revelation, my relationship with Vhorrek deepened. Not in the sentimental sense. Plague Marines do not form friendships the way baseline humans do. We form working partnerships based on mutual utility, shared experience, and the practical reality that a brother who has fought beside you for 2,000 years is a brother you can predict, and predictability is the most valuable quality in a comrade in arms. But there was something else between us now, a shared understanding that extended beyond tactics and plaguecraft into the realm of the personal. Vhorrek had been a Death Guard legionnaire during the heresy. He had walked alongside Mortarion. He had been in the Death Guard fleet when Typhus opened the way to the warp and the destroyer plague consumed the Legion. He had experienced his own fall, his own transformation, his own reckoning with the truth that his fate had been decided by powers beyond his comprehension. He knew what it was to be a crop rather than a gardener, and he had made his peace with it 2 millennia before I was born, the same way I was making my peace with it now. We did not speak of it again. We did not need to. The truth sat between us like a shared meal, digested and absorbed, and the war continued, and millennia went past the way they do. Hethric's Vectorium became known within the Death Guard as specialists in long-term ecological warfare. We seeded worlds that would not show symptoms for 300 years. We put pathogen families into planetary biospheres that would sleep for generations before waking. We played the long game, and when you have eternity, the long game is the only game there is. I rose through the ranks. This is a strange concept in the Death Guard, where hierarchy is less a formal structure and more a matter of practical authority accumulated through survival and competence. I became a plague champion, which is roughly equivalent to a sergeant in loyalist terms, commanding a squad of 7 brothers, 4 former Cenotaphs and 3 who had joined us from other fallen warbands over the centuries. I became a keeper of plagues, maintaining a personal collection of pathogen samples that I had gathered from 100 different worlds, each one catalogued, preserved, and available for deployment as needed. I became, in my own quiet, amused way, good at what I did. Not brilliant, not legendary. Good, consistent, reliable. The same qualities that had made me a competent Cenotaph made me a competent Plague Marine. Endurance over spectacle, persistence over brilliance. Some things do not change, even when everything else does. Hethrec fell at the Siege of Rathan, a fortress world in the Scaris sector, during what I believe was the 38th millennium, though I could be off by a century in either direction. He was killed by an Eversor assassin that the Officio Assassinorum had built, drugged, and fired at him from orbit for exactly that purpose. The pod came down through our air cover on a ballistic arc that no gunship could have survived, because a pod does not need to survive, it only needs to arrive. What came out of it was not entirely a man anymore. Its muscles were tearing themselves apart from the force of their own contraction. Its blood had been replaced with something that killed on contact. It crossed 60 meters of open ground in under 4 seconds and drove a neuro-gauntlet through Hethric's primary heart before a single one of us had finished turning around. Hethrec killed it. He caught its skull between his palms and crushed it, and the Eversor did what Eversors do when they die, which is detonate. The bio-meltdown took 11 of my brothers, most of Hethric's command staff, and a section of fortification wall 4 meters thick. I was thrown roughly 30 meters and lost the use of my left arm for 2 years. Hethrec was still standing when the smoke cleared, because Hethrec was always still standing, but the gauntlet's venom was already in his chest, and there is no surgery in this galaxy or any other that undoes an Eversor's work. He died over 3 days. Slowly, with a continuous low chuckle that might have been amusement, or might have been a death rattle, or might have been both. I was at his side when he died. Geka sat on his chest, poking at the wound with its stubby fingers, making small noises of curiosity. Hethric's last coherent words were directed at the Nurgling. "Stop that." The Nurgling did not stop. Hethrec died. Geka crawled back to my chest plate. Life, such as it was, went on. Without Hethrec, the Vectorium came apart. That is normal. In the Death Guard, leadership is personal, not institutional. And when a lord dies, his followers scatter. I did not want a Vectorium. I wanted the work. So I took my squad, my collection, and my Nurgling, and I drifted. Drifting is not aimless. After enough centuries in the current, you can feel which way the grandfather wants you to go. Not an order, a gravitational pull. I followed it to worlds I had never heard of and conflicts I had no stake in, to places where the garden needed tending and I was the closest gardener. I fought in the Gothic War, briefly, seeding plague aboard Imperial Navy vessels during the confusion of Abaddon's offensive. I fought in the Third War for Armageddon, very briefly, deploying a biological agent in the underhive of Hive Infernus that was designed to weaken the immune systems of the human defenders and make them more susceptible to the orc-borne pathogens that were already rampaging through the lower levels. The Imperium wrote hymns about Armageddon. Nobody has ever written anything about what I did in the Underhive. That is how a plague is supposed to be received. I operated alone, or nearly alone, for periods of decades and sometimes centuries. A solitary plague marine moving through the galaxy like a virus through a bloodstream, finding receptive cells and doing what viruses do. And then the Great Rift opened, and the galaxy broke in half, and everything changed. The cicatrix maledictum, the wound across reality, a tear in the fabric of the materium that stretched from the Eye of Terror to the eastern fringe, splitting the Imperium into two halves and flooding real space with warp energy on a scale that had not been seen since the fall of the Eldar. For the forces of chaos, this was not a catastrophe. It was a harvest. The veil between the material and the immaterial had been worn thin across half the galaxy, and through that thinness the grandfather's influence could seep like moisture through a cracked wall, touching worlds that had been sealed against corruption for millennia. I felt it happen. I was aboard a hulk in the Coronis expanse when the rift opened, and I felt the shift in the warp like a change in air pressure, a sudden expansion of possibility. A door opening in a room that had been sealed shut for 10,000 years. The grandfather's presence, which had always been a background hum, a subsonic pulse beneath the noise of reality, suddenly became deafening, overwhelming, joyous. The garden was expanding, and the gardeners were called to work. I rejoined a Death Guard strike force operating in the Scourge Stars, the cluster of demon worlds that Mortarion, the Primarch himself, had established in the wake of the rift's opening. I did not see Mortarion. Very few do. The Primarch operates on a level of strategic abstraction that individual Plague Marines cannot access or comprehend. He plans in centuries and deploys in millennia, and sees the galaxy as a single organism to be infected, rather than a collection of worlds to be conquered. I served under a lord named Grelak the Patient, a Death Guard veteran of modest reputation and immodest plaguecraft, who commanded a flotilla of 4 corrupted vessels and approximately 300 Plague Marines of varying origin and allegiance. Grelak's assignment was straightforward, at least in concept. A world called Thesivan Proxima in the Tefran Reach had been identified as a priority target for Nurgle's forces. The world was a fortress, heavily defended, garrisoned by Imperial Guard regiments, and a detachment of Astartes, and strategically positioned astride warp routes that the Death Guard needed for their push deeper into Segmentum Obscurus. Grelak's task was to take the world, break the garrison, claim it for the grandfather. Thesivane Proxima. I heard the name and I felt something move in my chest that was not decay. Thesivane. The fortress monastery of the Cenotaphs had been on a world called Thesivane. Not Thesivane Proxima, not the same world, but the name was not a coincidence. In the Imperium, Proxima designations are given to worlds that are close to another world of the same name, typically in the same system or a neighboring one. Thesavenae Proxima was in the Tefrin Reach. The Cenotaphs had operated in the Tefrin Reach. The implications were not subtle, and I had drifted here. That is the word I use, drifted, because it is the word that lets me pretend I chose the direction. I had followed the pull, the gentle gravitational insistence of the grandfather's will, across 4,000 years and half a galaxy, and it had brought me to a strike force whose assignment was a world that shared a name with the fortress where I had been buried alive. I had learned on a hillside on Draven's Holt what the grandfather does with a man's path when he wants something from him. I did not ask whether this was arranged. I knew better than to ask questions when I already had the answer and did not want it. I said nothing. I prepared for deployment. Grelak's flotilla translated from the warp into the Thesavenae system and began its approach. Long-range augury confirmed the garrison. 6 Imperial Guard regiments, approximately 90,000 soldiers, orbital defense platforms, moderate capability, a planetary shield generator, and in the fortress citadel at the planet's northern pole, a detachment of Adeptus Astartes. The augury data included heraldic identification, gray and white armor, a chapter icon featuring an empty tomb beneath a single star. Chapter designation, the Cenotaphs. There are moments in a 9,000-year life that crystallize, that snap into focus with a clarity that the intervening millennia of blurred, compressed time cannot match. This was one of them. I stood in the strategium of Grelak's flagship, staring at a hololithic display showing the heraldry of a chapter that I had served for 300 years, a chapter that had died on Thesavenae 9 millennia ago, and I understood with the absolute certainty that comes from having been surprised exactly once in 9,000 years and refusing to be surprised again, what I was looking at. The Imperium had refounded the Cenotaphs. The founding notice I had read on Kelvrath's cradle, buried in 4 centuries of tithe accounting, had not been a clerical error. Nearly 7,000 years later, the stone in my boot finally worked its way through the leather. This happens. When a chapter is destroyed, the Administratum occasionally authorizes a refounding, creating a new chapter from preserved gene seed stocks bearing the destroyed chapter's designation and heraldry. It is meant as a continuity measure, a way of preserving institutional knowledge and strategic capability. In practice, it is a ghost story, a dead name draped over living bodies. Vhorrek, standing at my shoulder, looked at the heraldic display and said nothing. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "They seem upset." It was not funny. It had never been funny. But he said it, and Durat made a sound that might have been a laugh if either of them still remembered how. And for a moment we were standing in the 4th Company billets on Thesavenae again, young and whole and unaware of what was coming. The new Cenotaphs would have no connection to the originals beyond gene seed and iconography. They would not know the corridors beneath Thesavenae. They would not know who Vortigern was, or what he had done, or why. And the doctrine of the empty grave, the philosophy that had defined us, that had, as I now knew, been our undoing, would have been purged from the record along with every other trace of the truth. Or so I assumed. I was wrong, but not in the way I expected. The assault on Thesavenae Proxima began with a plague bombardment. Grelak's ships launched canisters of concentrated pathogen into the upper atmosphere, seeding the jet streams with a fast-acting respiratory infection designed to degrade the garrison's combat effectiveness before the ground assault began. This is standard Death Guard doctrine. Soften the target biologically before committing forces. Make them sick, make them weak, make them desperate. Desperation makes defenders sloppy, and sloppy defenders make mistakes, and mistakes create openings, and openings are where Plague Marines do their best work. The planetary shield absorbed the first wave of bombardment. It did not absorb the second. By the third day, canisters were detonating in the stratosphere, and the wind was doing our work for us, carrying the pathogen across the northern continent where the bulk of the garrison was stationed. Reports from intercepted Vox traffic indicated widespread respiratory distress among the guard regiments within 48 hours. The Astartes, predictably, were less affected. Their physiology is hardened against biological agents in ways that baseline humans cannot match. But even Astartes breathe, and even Astartes can be weakened, and the pathogen was not designed to kill them. It was designed to slow them down by exactly enough to matter. We made planetfall on the 5th day. Grelak committed his full force, 300 Plague Marines in a multi-vector drop across the northern continent, targeting the fortress citadel and the surrounding military installations simultaneously. I commanded my squad in the secondary assault wave, tasked with breaching the citadel's outer perimeter, while the primary wave engaged the guard regiments in the field. The drop was rough. Thesivane Proxima had atmospheric defenses that the plague bombardment had not neutralized, and we lost 2 Thunderhawks on approach, 57 brothers scattered across kilometers of frozen tundra. My transport made it through with nothing worse than a hull breach and a starboard engine fire, both of which were resolved by the simple expedient of not caring about them. We hit the ground running. The citadel's outer walls were impressive by Imperial standards, 30 meters of reinforced rockcrete studded with weapon emplacements and defensive positions manned by soldiers who were visibly sick but still fighting. I have to give them credit for that. The guard regiments on Thesivane Proxima were disciplined, well-led, and committed to their defense despite the pathogen rotting their lungs from the inside. They fired from positions they should have abandoned. They held walls they should have surrendered. They died in numbers that should have been enough to make any rational commander withdraw, and they kept dying, because dying in the Emperor's service is what the Imperial Guard does. And they do it with a dedication that I find simultaneously admirable and deeply, deeply wasteful. We breached the outer wall through a section that had been weakened by plague-corroded structural supports. My squad pushed through first, into a killing ground between the outer and inner walls that the defenders had prepared with overlapping fields of fire and pre-registered artillery positions. It was a trap, a good one. They had anticipated the breach point, positioned heavy weapons teams on the inner wall, and preloaded a counter-assault force in concealed positions along the flanks. If we had been loyalist Astartes, it would have worked. We would have been caught in a crossfire, pinned in the killing ground, and ground down by sustained firepower. We were not loyalist Astartes. We walked into the killing ground and let them shoot us. This sounds suicidal. It is not. It is doctrine. A Plague Marine's body is not a liability. It is a weapon system. Every bolt round that embeds itself in my flesh is a bolt round that is not hitting something important. Every last beam that scorches my armor is energy spent on a target that feels pain as a distant advisory, rather than an immediate crisis. The defenders of Thesivane Proxima poured everything they had into the killing ground, and we absorbed it the way a sponge absorbs water, and then we walked through it. There is a particular silence that settles over a defensive position at the moment the defenders understand that their trap worked perfectly, and it has changed nothing. Every gun fired. Every range was correct. Every man did his job. And the enemy is still walking toward them at exactly the same pace. I have heard that silence on more worlds than I could name, and I would not be able to name them even if I tried, because I have never once kept a list of anything worth keeping a list of. It has never lost its appeal. Then we were inside the inner wall, and the close quarters work began. It was in the inner corridors of the citadel that I first encountered the new Cenotaphs. They came around a corner in a tactical formation that I recognized immediately because I had used it myself for 3 centuries. The Wedge of Silence, a close quarters breakthrough pattern designed for corridor fighting, with the assault element in a narrow spearhead and suppressive fire funneled along the walls to clear positions without exposing the advancing brothers to enfilade. It was a Cenotaphs technique, developed by our 3rd chapter master, Vhorrek the Quiet, and taught to every brother as part of basic tactical indoctrination. And here was the joke, the first of the 2 that Citadel had waiting for me. A chapter hides many things. It never hides its tactics. Why would it? A tactic is the thing that wins, and you do not bury the thing that wins. So we used the Wedge of Silence for 1,000 years in front of Allied regiments and Munitorum observers, and every Imperial officer who ever filed an after-action report, and it went into the archives, and it sat there, and it outlived every man who ever taught it. The new Cenotaphs were using it. They were using it well. They were beautiful. I do not mean that sentimentally. I mean it technically, aesthetically, objectively. Their armor was gray and white, clean, polished, maintained to a standard that made my corroded, growth-encrusted plate look like a ruin. The chapter icon was correct, the empty tomb beneath the single star, rendered in silver on their left pauldrons with a precision that spoke of reverence. But there was something else on their armor that stopped me. Names, etched into their vambraces, their greaves, their pauldrons. Names of the fallen, inscribed individually, carried into battle as personal memorials. These Cenotaphs did not practice the doctrine of the empty grave. They had inverted it. Where we had erased our dead, they preserved them. Where we had worshipped anonymity, they worshipped remembrance. Somewhere in the 9 millennia since our fall, someone had examined the original Cenotaph's philosophy and concluded, correctly, that it was poison, that the doctrine of the empty grave had been the pathway to corruption, and they had rebuilt the chapter on the opposite foundation, a chapter that remembered everything and forgot nothing, that carried its dead as armor rather than burying them as silence. They were right. They were absolutely, completely, catastrophically right about all of it, and it did not save them. I killed the first one with a plague knife through the throat seal. He was young, relatively speaking. 50 years in service, maybe 60. His eyes, visible through his helmet lenses, were bright blue, unclouded, fierce with the righteous fury of a warrior defending his home against the forces of corruption. He did not know who I was. He did not know what I was. He saw a Plague Marine, a monster, a thing to be destroyed, and he fought me with every ounce of skill and strength and courage that his training had given him, and he died on my blade, and his blood was red, clean red, the red of a body that had never known the grandfather's touch, and it steamed in the cold air of the corridor like a prayer evaporating. More came. The new Cenotaphs deployed their full strength within the citadel, approximately 70 battle brothers, reinforcing the guard units that were crumbling under the weight of our assault. They fought well. They fought better than well. They fought with a ferocity and a discipline that reminded me painfully, viscerally, of what the Cenotaphs had been before the fall. They held corridors that should have fallen. They counterattacked positions that should have been indefensible. They died one by one, brother by brother, and each death was a deliberate, measured sacrifice that bought time for the others to regroup and re-engage. And as they died, they called out names. This stopped me, not physically. Physically, I continued fighting, continued killing, continued advancing through the citadel with the mechanical efficiency of a 9,000-year veteran who has fought in more corridors than he can remember. But mentally, emotionally, in the part of me that still experiences something resembling human feeling, the names stopped me cold. They were calling upon the saints, the martyrs, the honored dead of the original Cenotaphs, the brothers who had, according to whatever sanitized history the Imperium had constructed, died fighting the enemies of the Emperor in the Tefran Reach 9 millennia ago. They were calling upon my brothers, my squad mates, my friends, insofar as the Cenotaphs had permitted the concept of friendship. They were calling upon Vhorrek, the chaplain who had taught me the doctrine of the empty grave. They were calling upon Rethane, my captain, who had led the 4th Company with quiet competence for 2 centuries. They were calling upon Vhorrek, the chapter master who had sold their souls to a plague god, to save them from a plague that the same god had sent. They were calling upon these names as saints, as heroes, as paragons of virtue and duty and sacrifice. They were dying with these names on their lips, drawing strength from the memory of warriors who had, in the official record, fallen nobly in the defense of the Imperium. The Imperium knew. That is the part people find hardest to believe, and it is the part I am most certain of. They sent Grey Knights to Grethane. You do not send Grey Knights on a rumor. Somewhere in the Ordo Malleus, there was a file with our name on it, and a very clear account of exactly what we had become. And a Lord Inquisitor read that file and acted on it, and 21 Terminators came through the screaming vortex and killed 211 of us in a single day. And then they went home and they sealed the file, because that is what the Inquisition does with a truth like ours. An entire chapter of Space Marines turned by a plague is not a fact the Imperium can afford to have circulating. It went into a vault under an authority code that requires a Lord Inquisitor's seal to open, and the public rolls recorded the Cenotaphs as destroyed with honor in the Tefran Reach, and everyone who could have contradicted that was either dead, sworn to silence, or standing on a methane world 11,000 light-years away, with fungus growing out of his chest. He ordered the gene seed destroyed. Of course he did. It is the second thing you do after the killing. I would stake what remains of my flesh on the existence of that order, somewhere, signed and sealed and dispatched with an inquisitorial rosette pressed into the wax. And then it went to the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Mechanicus does not take orders from the Inquisition. It receives requests, and it honors them according to its own rites and its own calendar and its own definition of the word soon. Burning gene seed is not a matter of opening a vault and applying a flame. It is a rite, and the rite requires a magos biologist of the correct ordination and the correct hymns, and a vault index naming which of 11 repositories holds Cenotaphs' tithe stock, and in what order, and by whom. I do not know what happened to that request. Nobody does. Perhaps they burned the wrong stock. Perhaps a Magos died and his successor inherited a backlog and worked it in the order he found it. The Inquisition seals its files. The Administratum keeps its own. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains the gene seed vaults. These 3 institutions have been failing to speak to one another for 10,000 years, and they are extremely good at it. Somewhere in a Mechanicus repository, a tithe of Cenotaphs' gene seed sat in stasis, catalogued, blessed, and entirely unburned. 3,000 years later, a clerk in the Administratum pulled a list of viable gene lines for the next refounding, and there we were, stable, orthodox, available. The Imperium decided to destroy us, wrote the order down, and lost it. And so the new Cenotaphs were raised, wearing our colors, carrying our name, inheriting a history that had been carefully edited to remove the ending. I pushed deeper into the citadel. My squad was reduced to 4 by this point. 3 former Cenotaphs and myself, fighting through resistance that was intensifying as we approached the Central Command Complex. The new Cenotaphs had concentrated their remaining forces here, 30-odd brothers forming a defensive perimeter around something they were clearly prepared to die protecting. I assumed it was a command center, a communications hub, something strategically vital. It was a chapel. They were protecting a chapel, a small, austere chamber at the heart of the citadel, decorated in the gray and white of the chapter, with a stone altar at the center, and reliquaries along the walls containing artifacts that I recognized with a shock of familiarity so intense that my body, my 9,000-year-old, plague-ridden, barely human body, actually stopped moving for 3 full seconds. The reliquaries contained armor plates, gray and white armor plates, ancient, battered, scarred by weapons that had not been manufactured in millennia. Fragments of the original Cenotaphs' war gear, preserved as sacred relics. There was a bolter with the serial number of the 4th Company's armory. There was a combat blade with a notch in the hilt that I remembered putting there myself 6,000 years ago when the blade glanced off an orc's skull and bit into a bulkhead instead. There was a shoulder pauldron with the empty tomb icon, cracked and faded, mounted on a velvet cushion like the crown jewel of a petty kingdom. And there was a banner. The banner was new, relatively speaking. It was perhaps 1,000 years old, painted on cured grox hide in the traditional style, depicting the chapter icon surrounded by a border of names. Names in gold leaf, each one inscribed with the care and precision that the Imperium reserves for its most sacred texts. The names of the original Cenotaphs. Every brother, every sergeant, every captain, every chaplain, every apothecary, every soul who had served the chapter from its founding to its fall. I stood there and I worked out where they had got them, because I could not work it out. We had erased those names. That was the entire point. Struck from the chapter rolls, burned out of the records, spoken once and never again. 9,000 years ago, I watched a chapter serf take a blade to a page and cut a dead brother's name out of the Muster book, and I thought it was the most solemn thing I had ever seen. But the chapter serf did not control every copy of that page. Every Astartes inducted into every chapter in the Imperium is recorded by the Administratum, not for honor, not for memory, for gene seed accounting. A chapter draws its tithe of aspirants, and the Administratum wants to know what it received in exchange. And so somewhere in a repository on a clerical world that none of us had ever heard of, a scribe wrote down my name and my recruitment world and my date of induction, and then filed it, and then died. And then that file sat in a stack for 9,000 years while the Cenotaphs burned their own history to ash in the name of humility. The doctrine of the empty grave was a chapter policy. The Administratum is a civilization. We were never going to win that. They had the names because the Imperium keeps everything it does not care about. I found my name in the lower third of the banner between Brother Vhorrek and Brother Durat. I turned around. They were standing behind me. Vhorrek, who had walked through 3 demolition charges on Kelvrath's cradle without slowing down. Durat, who could still thread a bolt round through a needle's eye at 700 meters with hands that no longer had the correct number of fingers. Both of them, very much alive, very much plague-ridden, very much not the martyred heroes that the gold leaf proclaimed them to be. Durat was looking at his own name on the banner. I do not know what he was thinking. I have known him for 9,000 years, and I have never once known what he was thinking. The inscription beside my name read, in high Gothic script, Brother Vhorrek, Tactical Sergeant, 4th Company, fell at Thessavine. His duty was his monument. His duty was his monument. They had given me an epitaph. The Cenotaphs, the chapter that had believed in empty graves and forgotten names, had been refounded by people who rejected everything the original chapter stood for, and they had given me an epitaph. And the epitaph said that my duty was my monument, and I was standing in their chapel looking at my own memorial while their inheritors died in the corridors outside, trying to protect it. The last cenotaph defender in the chapel was a chaplain. He stood before the banner with a crozius in one hand and a bolt pistol in the other, his skull-faced helmet turned toward me. He was wounded. His left arm hung useless, and the black of his armor was cracked across the chest, where something heavy had struck him and not quite broken through. But his voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear and completely devoid of fear. He said that I would not desecrate this place, that the names on the banner behind him were the reason he was still standing, that the dead are what make the living worth fighting for, and that a warrior who forgets his brothers has already surrendered whatever it is that makes him worth saving. Chaplain Vhorrek had stood in a corridor beneath Thessivane 9,000 years ago and taught me the exact opposite. The dead should not shackle the living. The dead should not be individuals at all. This chaplain was right. Vhorrek had been wrong. I was standing in the room wearing the proof of both, and he had no way of knowing it. I could have told him. I could have removed my helmet, shown him the face that the plague had made, and said, I am Vhorrek. I am the monument. I am the duty. I am the empty grave that your chapter was named for, and I am standing in front of you, and I am not dead, and I was never a hero, and everything you believe is a fiction, built on a foundation of lies that were told to hide the truth, that the Imperium is too fragile to bear. I did not tell him. I killed him quickly, cleanly, with a single thrust through the chest plate that pierced both hearts simultaneously. He fell at the foot of the banner beneath my name, and his blood pooled around the base of the reliquary that held the combat blade with the notch that I had put in the hilt thousands of years ago. Thessivane Proxima fell within the week. Grelak claimed it for the grandfather, and the garden began to grow, and the citadel with its chapel and its banner and its relics was consumed by the same organic expansion that consumed everything the Death Guard touched. The gold leaf names dissolved, the armor fragments corroded, the banner rotted, the cured Grok's hide returning to the biological material from which it had been made, and the names, all of them, every brother of the original Cenotaphs, were finally, truly, completely forgotten. The doctrine of the empty grave fulfilled at last, not by the brothers who had created it, by the plague that had consumed them. Everything ends, stars burn out, empires fall, names are written in gold, and then the gold dissolves, and the names go, and the universe carries on without them, neither poorer nor richer for the loss. I am not a hero, and I am not a villain. I am a gardener. I tend the compost, I spread the seed, and I watch the new growth push up through the rot of the old, and I find it beautiful. The grandfather smiles. The garden grows. Decay stirs in the cavity of my chest plate, poking at the edges of the crater where it has lived for longer than most civilizations endure, making small noises of contentment. Vorin walks beside me, silent as ever. Durat finds his angle, his elevation, his impossible sight line. Somewhere on some world I have not yet visited, flowers are growing from the inside of human skulls, threading their roots through the eye sockets, splitting the palates, cracking the mandibles apart. The petals are opening. The spores are rising. The garden is expanding, one bloom at a time. And it will never stop, because gardens do not stop, because growth does not stop, because the only thing in the universe that never ends is ending itself. And I, Vhorrek the Mirthful, brother of the empty grave, plague champion of the Death Guard, continue my work. It is good work. It is the only work there is.